Are you the parent of a child and you simply cannot figure out what is going on for them behaviorally? Maybe they have really, really explosive behavior, or maybe they're completely fine at school, but when they come home, they're like a feral animal. Maybe people are telling you they'll grow out of it, or all kids do that, but you deep down as a parent know that something else is going on. Or maybe you're the parent of a teen and they've received a ton of diagnoses like ADHD or generalized anxiety, autism, even bipolar. And none of the approaches that you've been given have been supportive and may have actually made things worse. So, these are all very common stories for parents of children and teens who are pathologically demand avoidant. And this may be the missing link for your family. And that's why today I want to dedicate a free training for parents who are confused and need more support to understand their unique child's brain wiring and nervous system. Hi, I'm Casey. I'm the founder of At Peace Parents, and I have helped thousands of parents of pathologically demand avoidant children and teens to support them through an autonomy and nervous system lens to thrive and get out of burnout. Okay, I also have a PDA son who is now 10 and doing wonderfully. However, he was in nervous system burnout for about a year and a half. So today I'm going to walk you through our 5 characteristic framework for understanding pathological demand avoidance so that you can determine if this fits your child. Okay, so we're going to talk about 5 things. We're going to first talk about the definition of pathological demand avoidance, equalizing behavior, which is what you're going to notice in your home. We're going to talk about masking, meaning 2 different versions of oneself. We're going to talk about the need for undivided one-on-one attention. And then finally, we're going to talk about the fluctuating nature of PDA and how things accumulate over time, which is why you may have thought that your child had like a regression all of a sudden, or it felt like your family's challenges came out of nowhere. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about the definition of pathological demand avoidance. So, despite the name, it doesn't always have to do with demand avoidance, and lots of things can cause demand avoidance. Like, for example, if your child has like tags on their shirt that are itchy, they're going to avoid putting on the shirt, and that is caused by sensory issues. But what's unique about pathological demand avoidance is that it's actually defined by a survival drive for autonomy and equality that consistently overrides other survival instincts like safety, toileting, sleep, hygiene, and or eating. Okay, so what does what does that mean in real life? What that means is every time your child or teen's survival brain, which is this part of the brain that is in pink, the limbic system and the amygdala, anytime that is perceiving that they don't have freedom, choice, or autonomy, or that they are not equal to or above another, if someone else is above them in stature, power, authority, they will perceive threat. And that will precipitate or cause a nervous system reaction where they will go into fight or flight, freeze, or shut down. Okay. So this will override other survival instincts. So, for example, you might have a child that in the moment, you tell them, don't get close to the street. And instead of avoiding the street or stopping, they're actually going to accelerate towards the cars in the street. Or you have a child for whom you're encouraging them to eat more and more, and the more you encourage them, the less they eat. Okay, and doctors will tell you, you know when they're hungry they'll eat, but as a parent you know that they actually won't eat even though they're hungry, because that survival drive for autonomy, for getting to choose around eating, will actually make it so that their nervous system shuts down, digestion slows, and they can't eat. Okay, so what we see in accumulation over time is often that we have patterns that might apply to your child or teen. Okay, so I'm gonna briefly talk about each one of these basic needs patterns to see if you can identify your child or teen. Okay, so let's first talk about safety. So, this is a big one, and we're going to talk about it with equalizing. But for many PDA children and teens, they have a fight flight reaction that is perceived by others as very much defiant or oppositional. Okay, so whenever they're perceiving that you're putting a limit down, saying no, or putting yourself in a position of authority or power, their brain is going to be like, hey, you're in danger or under life threat. Okay. And what they might do is have this aggressive nervous system response where they're aggressive towards another, like hitting, biting, kicking, screaming, throwing things. They might have a flight response, which is also called elopement, running out of the house or away from you. And there can also be patterns like attacking a sibling, attacking a parent, hitting other children, or it can be towards self. Okay, so that could be self harm or dangerous behaviors, headbanging, etc. Toileting, what we might see, patterns we might see as that nervous system stress accumulates is we might see a child who is completely toilet trained and then they have what looks like a regression where they need to start going to the bathroom in a diaper again, even though they're 6, 7, 8 years old. Maybe they'll only poop in the bathtub or in a certain location in their backyard, or they're starting to control their toileting, or they need their parent to wipe them at the age of 10. They might need their parent in the bathroom with them. Other patterns you might see are a child who is peeing all over the floor, and the more that you try and use behavioral approaches, sticker charts, etc., the more pronounced this behavior is. We also see the physiological impact on toileting and digestion. So there's patterns of withholding and caprices, UTIs, and struggles with toileting in general, which is a topic that can be hard for parents to talk about because it's, so sensitive. But we do see these patterns because the nervous system is impacted by the losses of autonomy and equality. And in terms of toileting, we often see that like traditional ways of potty training are actually making things worse. Sleep, what we might see is a child pushing the bedtime further and further back or having really early morning wake cycles. For teens, you can see sometimes they're going into a non 24-hour sleep cycle, or every night they're pushing 1 hour back and then they're sleeping through the day, which makes it impossible to access school. Or children needing to co-sleep or be physically touching their parent even when they're much older than like 6 in order to feel safe enough to fall asleep. Lots of night waking. We might see hygiene impacted, which would be a child or teen who refuses to brush teeth, bathe, wash their hair. And this can range from resistance to those things all the way to, physically fighting their parents if they try and make them brush their teeth or wash their hair or bathe, to the point where we might see a child or teen who hasn't been able to access hygiene for months. Okay. And then eating, which is near and dear to my heart because that was where my son's basic need struggle played out the most prominently, was increasing restricted eating to the point where he was only eating 3 processed foods: popcorn, Pirate's Booty, and Lay's potato chips. And the more we tried to support that through traditional methods of exposure, behavioral therapy, sticker charts, rewards and consequences, timeouts, all the things, the more and more restricted the eating got, to the point where he was at risk of a feeding tube. Okay. And we can also see patterns of compulsive eating, or even a child who's very restricted in their eating, but then the child's restricted eating at the same time they constantly want to be eating those crunchy snacks for oral regulation. Okay. So these basic needs struggles have often been looked at separately or distinct from some of the more behavioral challenges that you might have noticed in your home, or if you're a therapist, you might have noticed with your clients and teacher with your students. Okay. So we want to understand again PDA as a nervous system difference or disability where every time that survival part of the brain, the pink part, is perceiving threat around losses of autonomy or feeling that someone else is above them. Okay. And this is going to be all the time for a kid because the nature of parenting in our culture is that we need to be the authority. We need to be in control. We need to teach them to be good. We need to make sure that they're putting their shoes on to go to school. Right. So every time we're sort of doing that or setting boundaries or telling them to do something, they are going to be perceiving threat in their system. Okay. And this can be really confusing for parents because, we're often looking at it through like a sensory lens, right? Like, why won't they get dressed for school? Maybe it's the socks that are itching them, or, why are they refusing school? It's all the bright lights and the noises of the kids and negative social feedback. But then they come home to be homeschooled and they have the exact same struggles, even though it's quiet and there are less children, because the parent is still pushing them through the curriculum. And it's those losses of autonomy that are causing the nervous system reaction and avoidance to school. Okay, so we want to just understand that root cause mechanism for why your child is struggling and what's causing those basic needs struggles. Okay, so this is just an image of the brain to support you in understanding that the approach to a PDA child is we really want to support them to get out of that survival response and back into that green part of the brain or the thinking brain where they can learn, access empathy, understand cause and effect. Okay. All right. So the second thing we want to be looking for in our families and households is what I call equalizing behavior. Okay, or this is like the behavioral expression of the disability or difference. Okay, so I'm going to give you lots of examples because this can be subtle and challenging to understand at first. Okay, so if we go back to what we learned about what's the root cause of the child avoiding or getting upset or having a meltdown or a panic attack, it's the perception of not having freedom and choice in the moment or someone being above them. Okay, so that hits their body, their nervous system, and they might not even be aware of it. And then they do a nervous system driven response to try and get back in control. Okay, so what we saw with basic needs is that their control was coalescing around one or more of those basic needs. But then we also see equalizing behavior. So let's say, I'm going to give you an example from my own life. My son comes home from school, drops his backpack down, drops his, you know, snow gear, throws it all over the kitchen floor, and just walks into the living room and says, I need potato chips. Okay. So maybe because I'm a parent and I think it's my job to be in a position of control and authority and I want a clean house like everyone else, I say, hey, Cooper, you need to pick that up. And he's like, no. And I'm like, Cooper, you need to pick that up and hang your coat up. Maybe he complies with my request or demand. But then after he hangs up the coat, he might go to where I am in the kitchen and knock down all the stuff that I'm working on, like the spices, because I'm cooking. Or maybe he's near his brother and his brother's building Legos and he's like hovering around his brother building Legos. And I say, Cooper, can you give William some space? Okay. So he's perceiving that as a loss of autonomy, like he's not got the freedom to be doing that. And I'm putting myself in a position where I'm telling him what to do, which is normal for a parent. perceives threat and then equalizes against his brother, which might be like telling him like, "You're so stupid, William, you don't know how to do anything right," or, hovering around and accidentally kicking his Legos. And it can be more extreme. It can be coming home from school as a teen who seems to be doing fine at school, and the moment they walk in the door, you're like, "Hey, how was school?" And they're like, "Shut up, you bitch." Right? And you're like, "What happened?" Okay? So this is equalizing behavior that can happen in the moment, or it can happen over time when they're off at school all day, come home, and then they are trying to get their nervous system back to safety. Other ways that this can look is controlling behavior, controlling your line of vision when, like, if they're watching an iPad and they're like, Mama, look," and then you look away at your phone, they start to escalate. They're trying to control your line of vision, or, you know, they're trying to control whether or not you can eat, whether or not you can go to the bathroom. Maybe they're constantly correcting your words or what happened. This can look like manipulation or even lying, right? In ways that feel strange and innocuous sometimes. Like, you know, I remember a time when my son's grandmother was telling the story of when I had my second son, and she's like, "I remember I came to your mom's house to stay the night with you, and she was in the hospital." And my PDA son said, "No, I spent the night at your house." And we all knew that he actually hadn't, but when my mother-in-law corrected him, he perceived that loss of autonomy and equality to her, activated and started equalizing and insisting on something that actually wasn't true. And the more that we corrected him, the more that he doubled down. Okay. This can also look like aggression, right? Targeting a sibling or another safe person in the home, usually the parent who is the lead parent, often the mom. Okay. So this can look like controlling, correcting, aggressive, seemingly manipulative behavior towards another. This also looks like always needing to be first out of the car, first down the stairs, having more of the dessert, more of the thing. I mean, I can give you an example from this morning. My 6-year-old wanted some dopamine in his hair, so we have this little semi-permanent blue hairspray for his hair so he can feel cool in kindergarten. This makes my PDA son feel like he's not equal to or above his brother. So he starts equalizing and trying to find a way that he can be above. And he's insisting on needing to also have the blue hairspray, even though it's my other son's. And then he's looking for ways to like be above with his temporary tattoos. Okay. So that's kind of an adaptive example, but the equalizing behavior can feel very, very abusive if you're on the receiving end of it, where it's targeted and constantly criticizing and correcting and telling you what you did is wrong, potentially interrupting behavior and saying poop, 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 pretending to be an animal like like a cat or a dog, and only meowing or barking in order to reduce meaningful conversation. Um, you know, there's all sorts of ways that this can play out. The way that's most obvious is when you tell them to do something or to stop doing something or to set a limit, and then you see an immediate fixation on them doing something that's either destructive or manipulative or targeted, right? So, one example is a parent who was on a subway in New York City telling their daughter, "Hey, like, don't touch the railing because there's germs on it." And then in response, the child didn't touch the railing, but put her tongue on the railing. Okay. So it's like an impulsive fixation, it's nervous system driven. This is extraordinarily difficult behavior because if you correct it, it activates that same nervous system threat perception, and they will double down or escalate that equalizing behavior. It can also feel like you can't have a conversation with a friend, a phone call, a sibling, a partner, because they're losing that autonomy or feeling like they don't have control, and they will just consistently interrupt and say, "Mama, mama." And if you don't respond, then start targeting a sibling or destroying or taking apart your things, which is equalizing behavior. Okay, so I want you to think of that mechanism, that whenever they're perceiving that loss of autonomy or feeling like you're above them, their nervous system is reacting like they're in danger or under life threat. And then the nervous system drives this behavior to be above you, to control, or to be like doing something to get back to that nervous system safety. Okay, so just reflect on those mechanisms for yourself, whether you have a 3-year-old or you have a 25-year-old, because especially with adults, this can look very subtle. It can be more verbal, right? It can be, you're talking about something in politics, right? And you know that they agree with you, but they perceive that you have, maybe at a cocktail party, that you have more attention coming towards you and you're the expert in that moment on the politics, and they start equalizing by arguing a counterpoint that actually isn't their political belief, right? So it can be super confusing because you're like, why are you doing this, right? But as soon as you understand what it is, it can help you identify this, whether it's your child or a spouse, because that's often the case as well. Okay, third thing we want to look for is high masking. Okay, and the way I think about this is a little bit different than the masking we think of in non-PDA autism, which is imitating neurotypical norms or imitating kids' ways of speaking, ways of interacting with each other teens' ways of being, maybe looking at scripts from watching kids on a show and then using their scripts and their mannerisms with other kids. So that's often what we think about as masking in the autism space, but it's a little bit more nuanced for PDA, because the way that I think about this is, what nervous system pathway is the threat perception going down? Okay, so bear with me for a second. So often when we have pathologically demand avoidant children and teens, we often see that fight flight behavior, that equalizing, which is very external, right? And we're like, oh my God, I can't believe no one else sees this. It's constant, it's impulsive, it's aggressive, like it's a feral animal, right? Like I used to think that about my son too. But when he was at school, he appeared completely typical, very social, made eye contact, and was doing fine, right? And so I had this dichotomy where people could not understand or believe the difference or what was going on at school. And this was also something that happened at his grandmother's house, right? But when I would pick him up from school or pick him up from his grandmother's house, it was like literally like his face would change and his behavior would change completely. Okay, so what I think this is the nervous system, the amygdala. Let's go back to that brain. The amygdala, that pink spot, is the threat detector in your brain. All of us have it. Okay, it's happening on a subconscious level faster than our frontal lobe, the green part, our rational brain. And it's meant to do that because it's meant to tell the body how to respond to danger or life threat before our rational brain kicks in. Okay, so when the child or teen is at school, on a subconscious neuroceptive level, they are actually perceiving danger and life threat at a level that they're often not at home, where they're unconditionally loved. Okay. And so instead of that fight flight coming out, their nervous system is telling the body, hey, it's not safe to be in fight flight. I'm going to drop down to freeze or shut down. Okay. And this is when we see more selective mutism. We see more of a compliant child, or there may be some masking of like socializing and being with other kids, but often it's a freeze or shutdown response at school. So they're not doing that externalization. They see you or they come home to your household where they are unconditionally loved and on a certain subconscious level know, as their mom or parent or dad, but usually it's the mom, um, they're safe. And so it comes back up out through fight flight. Okay. So this high masking or two versions of oneself is actually the characteristic of the five that I'm describing today that I believe makes it so challenging for parents to find schools that can work with PDA children, to find therapists and pediatricians that can believe what's actually going on, and for them to get diagnoses, and even for spouses and grandparents to understand the severity of the situation because it's often impacting, as I said in the beginning, basic needs and safety in the home. Okay. So if you're watching live, feel free to comment if that is resonating, these first three of the five characteristics. So we have a survival drive for autonomy and equality that overrides other survival instincts and basic needs. Eating, sleeping, hygiene, safety, and or toileting can also impact movement, leaving the house, being able to learn, going to school, etc. Equalizing behavior, and then high masking. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, the fourth characteristic that we want to look for and understand is more pronounced for children who have a more external presentation, which is like the more equalizing, more fight flight behavior. And that is the constant need for one on one attention. Okay, so how is this going to feel for a parent? It's going to feel like your kid's really smart, they know how to do things, and yet they absolutely cannot play independently, even though they're maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They need your constant attention or another person's one on one constant attention to be able to engage or access whatever they're playing with. And if they don't have it, they start to escalate. And this can be very, very confusing because PDA kids are often very smart, very capable, and they have the physical capacity to figure something out, but they won't engage. And this can start very, very young. I have this memory of when I had my first son, my PDA-er. I felt like I was improving and entertaining him even from a very young age. Like when I was dangling things in front of him, he wasn't reaching out for them. And he was constantly dysregulated and crying and screaming unless I was sort of improving and playing for him. Okay. And I spent a lot of time setting up, quiet spaces and lots of play stuff and trying to help him learn how to play. And he absolutely could not do it. He needed these signals of nervous system safety. It wasn't a skill deficit. Okay. So, how this might play out in the home would be, you know, you literally cannot do anything when, even if you're just one-on-one with your child who's PDA, because if you try and do laundry, if you try and respond to a text, if you try and make phone calls, talk to your spouse, do the dishes, anything, even if you're speaking to them while you're doing it, they may start escalating. And if you don't divert the one-on-one attention to them, they are starting to be destructive, taking things apart in the home, taking apart the printer or targeting with equalizing behavior a sibling, right? So as a parent, you're faced with this really difficult decision where it's like, well, I can keep trying to do the laundry, but then my 3-year-old is getting attacked, right? And this is the sort of choice point that from the outside looking in, people have a really hard time understanding. But if you're feeling this, then this might be describing that need for one-on-one attention. It can also look like, well, my child, when I'm with him one-on-one looks so typical and does great, right? So if I'm one-on-one and totally not distracted and just playing with my son, he doesn't look autistic, he doesn't look like he's struggling, but as soon as I divert my attention, there's that escalation, dysregulation. This can play out much more subtly with older PDAers where they're constantly like wanting your focused attention and sort of like impulsively asking for it verbally in a way that's so interruptive, like interrupting you so much that you have to divert your attention in order to give that attention to them. Okay. And this is seeking safety, nervous system safety, because remember the definition of pathological demand avoidance is constantly having that activation in their body around perceiving threat. Even if we don't see, because it's not like there's a natural disaster or, something happens externally that we can observe as parents that is letting us know, oh, there's a reason for the nervous system to activate, but rather it's their subconscious perception around autonomy and equality. Okay. So the fifth characteristic that I want you to be thinking about and looking for is the cumulative nature of nervous system activation. That sounds fancy, but it's not. What this means is that often for parents, this feels like it comes out of nowhere, right? It can happen like maybe your child goes into what's called burnout, where it's like all of a sudden there's this change, right? Maybe it's after a baby was born, a divorce, a move, the death in the family, or them starting kindergarten or a new school. And they've been perceiving threat in their nervous system over time, but they've had enough accommodations from you intuitively as a parent because you're a good parent, you're paying attention and you're, attached to them, etc. But then they have this big loss of autonomy, or you have another child in the home, which is what happened for me when my son went into burnout. And all of a sudden, you have to divert that attention. And it tips them past their threshold for how much activation can build in their system. And then we start to see a child who's so far past their tolerance for their nervous system activating, just like any other human who would be experiencing trauma, would start to have these big behavioral responses and big impacts on basic needs, like a toileting regression, or like my son all of a sudden stopping eating and then having these enormous feral meltdowns. And the question parents often has is like, did something happen? What happened at daycare? What happened at school? What happened for this teen that caused this, right? And if you have a child who's more freeze or more internalized, this can be even harder to recognize until later because it's not always externalized, okay? So this can be one of the hardest things to understand because as parents, when we're working with therapists or teachers or doctors or behavioral specialists, they're going to be working through the framework of what's called the ABC framework of behavior, which is there's an antecedent or something that happens right before the big behavior, and the consequence. So, maybe your kid is having these big meltdowns and you're like, okay, what did I say or do? Or did I like put a bright light on and that activated the nervous system and they had a meltdown? But with a PDA, or instead of it being an antecedent, it's a tipping point because it's always building in their system from this subconscious perception of threat to the point where one little thing that maybe the day before doesn't bother them tips them over and they have this like explosion out of nowhere, or they have a shutdown out of nowhere. And so this cumulative nervous system activation, meaning building in the body over time, not just in a day, not just the idea of restraint collapse, but rather over weeks, months, or even years, is why we see burnout, or what some people call autistic regression, for these kids. But what it really is is like any human, if they're constantly perceiving threat, even if it's just perception, and they're starting to experience what is traumatic and inescapable from their perspective, they will start to have a physiological impact on basic needs. They will start controlling basic needs and other people, and they will be past what they can tolerate as a mammal, right? And so, in order to support these kids, teens, and adults, the goal is not to teach them new behaviors because the behaviors are nervous system driven. And you can't teach a nervous system to not have a survival response, okay? Because that's what they're designed to do, to keep us alive. And our child is having these neuroceptive responses based on autonomy and equality. So the goal of parents, and this is what I work with parents to do, and I've done in my own home, is to bring down that threat response through accommodations and a very different approach to supporting a child that doesn't look traditional. Okay. So lots of hope here. Lots of things we can do to support these kids, but today's goal was to support you as a parent to determine, is this relevant to me, right? Like, does this apply to my child or teen? Because there's a lot of debate out there about what pathological demand avoidance is. And these 5 characteristics have been what has been supportive to the families that I work with. Okay. So I am happy to hang for a little bit to take questions. I saw Misha said, yeah, I'm doing this for the first time. Others here, I missed the start. Do we wait until the end for questions? Yeah. So I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Ehrlich, how do you feel about panda strategies? So I am not an expert in pandas, but I have worked with a lot of families whose children have PDA and pandas. So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of pandas is that it is the result of an infection, a strep infection, or another virus or bacterial infection that causes inflammation and impacts, I think, the same part of the brain that we're talking about for pathological demand avoidance, right? Causing a lot of the same behaviors that we see with PDA, right? And so it can be super confusing of like, is this pandas or is this pathological demand avoidance? I think only a medical doctor can determine if your child is pandas. They have centers and resources in universities. They have lots of medical doctors in the United States that can test for this. And then, from my understanding, there are medical interventions, right? Like antibiotics and different things you can do, right? The families I work with who have pandas are often neurodivergent children, PDA children who are already PDA. But when they get the infection, which they're more susceptible to because autistic, ADHD, PDA humans are more susceptible to inflammation, etc. That's what the research shows. Then they have the pandas, which exacerbates some of these same mechanisms. Okay. So this is not to say it has to be an either or, but if you are treating pandas medically and it hasn't helped everything over consistent amounts of time, that is when we might consider that there is a brain wiring difference, right? Or if you are treating it medically with professionals and it helps, then you wouldn't necessarily infer that your child was PDA. I think I always want to encourage parents to use their intuition and make decisions, which gives you the freedom, but also the responsibility to decide, are the strategies that I'm teaching for pathological demand avoidance, supportive of your child's well-being, mental health, and relationship. Okay? So that is what I would say. Yeah. Um, yeah, how to help a 16-year-old son, which doctor or therapist can help. So, if you're new to PDA, what I would recommend is to look into, and you're in the United States, PDA North America has a list of PDA affirming practitioners that you can start with in terms of getting a diagnosis or finding therapists in your area. So that would be the first place I would start. Yeah, so let's go to Chris here. Are there any specific strategies for non-parents, teachers, counselors to help support PDA youth and adults? So, yes, it's a different audience, but we actually on our website have a free training for therapists that talks about the 12 most effective accommodations that you can use in a more clinical setting or in a teaching setting. You have to generalize a little bit to your particular case, but it definitely applies within the context of teachers, therapists, counselors. So if you want to check out our website, there are, I think, 6 free trainings that you can access. And one of them is for therapists. So, yeah, I hope it's supportive of you. You are so welcome, David. I am going to jump off because I am at the end of this training, but I was so happy to be here with you live. This was my very first YouTube live. I've never done it before. So I was a little bit clunky at the beginning, but I'm happy to be here with all of you, and I will see you again soon. Bye.